Hello there, a warm welcome. This is Bridging Minds podcast, and you've arrived with us for part two and hour two of our fascinating conversation with Dr. John Andrew Morrow concerning his research and work into the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christian communities of his time, the Covenants Initiative, and his own recollections and discussions of his experiences as a Muslim convert coming into Islam in his early teens, some of the trauma that he experienced, some of the things that he witnessed, and a lot of his thoughts concerning some of the unfortunate directions our Muslim communities have taken, and much, much more. So, by all means, please sit down, join us. If you like what you hear and see, click the like button and subscribe, and please share this with other people. Thank you. Maria, so you must be familiar with Maria Rosa Minocal and her work.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, she's I think she passed away a few years ago tragically, but I would read her papers and some of her books and just about, and unfortunately I don't know Spanish. I used to, but I lost a lot of my Spanish. But there's just so much literature, like Italians. I think Umberto Eco, when he was like an undergrad and going to grad school, he was a semiotician, semiotics especially, but him and the other people in Italy at that time were also looking into like Morisco literature. It was just the whole linguistic, the whole connection of like Romance studies
Yes.
and there's certain things about Romance studies that, as much as Indo-Europeanists and Romanticists, especially back then when you have more political, a little more politicized, like East versus West, or Christian versus Christendom versus Darul Islam, kind of like lingering old animosities, like crusading stuff.
Right.
You have that old school scholarship, but then there was younger people in the late 50s, early 60s, going to the 70s, and they came to realize that there's a lot about uh, Romance studies, a lot about and about the transmission of the troubadour literature and all these different things that you kind of have to embrace the literature of Andalusia and Moriscos and the Moorish question there. So it startles me that Muslims aren't interested in these things. It's like you run into a few brothers here and there, and if you can articulate well to them, and this, I guess this will be an interesting segue because you mentioned this Garshuni manuscript. Like how many? There's even Iraqis who don't know that Garshuni exists.
Right.
There's a fascinating history within Arabic paleography
Hmm.
and Syriac paleography in this intersection
Right.
of Arabic language, Syriac script. Syriac language sometimes, Arabic script.
Yeah.
Aramaic, um, renditions of an Arabic textual tradition, with the Nabateans, Palmyra, just across the whole from Syria over to Iraq into northern Arabia.
Yes.
People,
And it's unfortunate that this lack of interest is even found among scholars and among some of the highest ranking scholars in the Muslim world. They simply have no interest in these matters. I mean, there are Muslims, but they tend to be academics and so on, and professors that are studying these ancient manuscripts. But, the status quo scholars, the official ulama, those high-ranking people, no interest, no interest, no interest. So, I mean, many years ago, well, it wasn't that long ago, after I published the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world, um, I was invited to the United Arab Emirates, and where I sat down and I had a session with diplomats and ambassadors from all over the Muslim world. I also presented my findings to academics and intellectuals from the Arab world. And they also convened all of the grand muftis from all over the Muslim world, not only the Arab world. They came from Afghanistan, they came from all over the place. And this was a closed door session. in which, they heard about these documents and they wanted to know, a little more about them. Well, on a positive note, after they heard what I had to say, they concluded that, I mean, there is nothing in these documents that contradict the Islamic tradition as we understand it. So we will not oppose you. But I actually brought copies of these manuscripts there, and we had them all on display. And I mean, these are ancient manuscripts. And one would assume that a scholar would have interest in such things. They show no interest whatsoever in even looking at them, examining them, reading them. It's just really they were trying to assess, is this a threat to, they were the Grand Muftis, is this a threat to our understanding of Islam? And they concluded that it isn't. But beyond that, no. And if they ever came across something that actually tweaked their understanding of Islam, they wouldn't be open to that. Oh, I can guarantee that to you because it's become an issue of dogma. Now, we can go back to the whole, epigraphic, all these revelations that we've had, but it's not, I mean, it's new to some people, but this has been going on for decades and decades and decades. They have been surveying the vast landscapes of Arabia and the surrounding countries. And there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of inscriptions from the 7th century, 8th century, and so on, some pre-Islamic. I mean, some are in Paleo-Arabic, some are in Safavidic. I mean, again, it has radically revised our understanding of Islam, right? And the period of Jahiliyyah, okay? Now, I mean, for many Muslims before Islam, it was the days of ignorance and people were ignorant. And it was widely believed, and even in some of my books, my previous books, in the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad and other books after that, I mean, that was published in 2013. I was talking about how few people were literate, and there was only a handful of companions who were literate. That is simply not true. Okay? Literacy was widespread in pre-Islamic Arabia. Even the average Bedouin can read and write. And this is indisputable. And so there was also a scribal tradition. So people could read and write. Okay. Now, again, like you said, how is this a threat to someone's faith? Okay. Your faith in God, how does that affect you? Your faith in the Prophet in the Quran? No. Why? Why would it? No. It's blind faith in what authors said about the Jahiliyyah, who were writing 300 years after the fact, who'd never been to Arabia, many of them. They'd never been to the Hijaz. They were living in Baghdad. These were elites, and they were trying to, maybe to the best of their ability, recreate the past. Okay? What came before Islam? Nothing. It starts with us. But we know that that's not true. And so we have all of this writing, and it does, it does tweak our understanding of the period. And it was widely believed that the Arabs were all a bunch of polytheists. They were all idol worshippers and so on, and performing human sacrifices. That has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be false. At one point scholars said yes, and then it started to shrink and shrink and shrink to the point where Aziz al-Azmi said, well, Mecca was a pagan reservation. So basically, the rest of Arabia had been Christianized or Judaized or whatever, and there was maybe a small group of idolaters and pagans still surviving in Mecca. But again, these people, they speak hadith, 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 hadith. These are written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact. Try to talk to these people about history, epigraphy, archaeology. Do you not consider, right? The archaeological record does not lie. And so what have we discovered? That monotheism was widespread in Arabia for several centuries before the rise of Islam. Okay? Again, why does this shake your faith? You know what I say? Wow, mashallah, this is incredible. I want to know more about this. We're not saying there wasn't a monotheistic revolution led by Muhammad. But the scholars in the field are talking about that is a second monotheistic revolution. But a monotheistic revolution took place before the rise of Islam. Was it Christianity? It could be. I mean, even the Islamic tradition hints at this. It talks about the Hanifs. Who were these people? And so you have scholars who say, well, there is no evidence of Judeo-Christianity or Aryans or these people in our record in the Levant, during those centuries. They seem to have disappeared. But no, hold on a second. They disappear from your record in Palestine and Lebanon and the Holy Land and Syria, but they appear in the Islamic record. These wandering holy men who were calling people to the religion of Ismail, to the religion of Abraham. To me, this is there seems to be a connection there. And we have, Waraka, he was a Christian, other people. So again, this is not, I don't see why any of this would be a threat to Islam or to our faith in any way. So, yeah.
And I wonder if I mean, if it, like, given how unclear that period is, looking at the Quran, how the Quran describes different communities of faith and addresses the Beni Israel, they address the Yahud, um, they addresses the Nasara. It also mentions Mushrikeen, but I wonder if it might if it's more of a matter of fluidity. If Arabia at the time, there was a lot of fluidity. Like, I mean, you look at Yathrib, which became Medina. It's clear that there are several Jewish clans there. What they call Judeo-Christianity, or monotheistic. Maybe a survival. Maybe I wonder if some of this is not even necessarily Aryan, more like Ebionite.
Yes.
Yeah,
There were so many different groups, and they were pushed out of Byzantium and so on, and they were hiding in the desert. They were hiding in caves. It only makes sense that they would be, in oases in Arabia and places like that. I mean, they were refugees, religious refugees, and it's not necessarily one group. There could have been many different groups with different ideas, and of course, we find some very unusual things in the Quran referring to beliefs of certain Christians and certain Jews. And then, scholars say, but these were not the beliefs of the Jews and the Christians in the old world as far as we know it. Well, maybe not, right? But it was certainly beliefs that were encountered in Arabia. Um, Again, the Quran is in conversation with many different faith communities, of which we know very little, but I'm open to learning about that.
I think openness to learning is a sign of iman. Like, it's our religion is we're supposed to our deen is supposed to be a deen of knowledge.
Yes.
Look at the early Muslims and their achievements of knowledge in vast fields. The modern I contend that the modern world as we know it, for better and worse, but better as well as in worse, but because someone can say, oh well, there's a lot of what influenced the Enlightenment, and if someone admits an Arabic influence in the Enlightenment, we've been heretical streams of Islamic thought and this and that, but there's still this vast civilizational influence
Yes.
that in it from the Dar Islam. But I personally would contend that the world that we know, even the medieval world, the world of medieval Europe itself, you know, post Andalusia, post Al Andalus, would have been inconceivable if it wasn't for the networks of knowledge um, they're created by Muslims.
Absolutely. They would have evolved in a different direction, no doubt. That influence was profound and pervasive.
Yeah, but why would contemporary Muslims be so afraid of literally cracking open a book, like the codices that we have. Many of the codex form of books,
Yes.
right? This is a book I checked out from Cincinnati's Mercantile Library. Not to do a plug, no commercial plug, but if there's anyone in the Midwest, do consider joining the Mercantile Library because it's probably the oldest private library in this region, and it's a vast repository of just literary artistic talent. And but that notwithstanding,
Yes.
using that as a prop, the
Yes.
form of the codex owes more to exemplars from Morocco, Algeria, from basically the Maghreb, than the late Roman form of the codex. Yeah, the late Roman, Western and Eastern form of the codex is sort of the ancestor, but the book as we know it today, um, the bound volumes, the organization in chapters, which would be babs, abwab in Arabic. So much of the organization and systemization and spread of knowledge and literacy, textuality. It's not to denigrate late antiquity, although Islam is part of late antiquity, the beginnings of Islam. It's not to denigrate the Greco-Roman or the Persian or the Indic or Chinese past, but Islam had a certain revolutionary influence on the spread of human knowledge internationally, and it completely just befuddles me, like
Yes.
what you were saying about these scholars at this colloquium. Like, here's the weird thing: if anything in what you presented felt like a threat to them, even no matter how true it was, they would have, Allah knows best. Maybe they would have been like, no, this is we're not putting our imprimatur on this, but like, okay, it's not a threat. We can move on. The closing of the Muslim mind, and I'm sorry for dominating this.
No, no, no. This is good.
Yeah, it just makes me reflect. The closing of the Muslim mind is one of the greatest tragedy, and the great tragedy is that many people don't realize it. And I find that it's interesting. It's interesting. Western, whether they are the children of immigrants, like you see it, like yeah, you see a real culture of knowledge among, for example, some Indo-Pakistani, in the UK, some Indo-Pakistani children of immigrants. This sort of way in which British, English, you know, South Asian Muslim communities there have like um, evolved and like culturally assimilated to some degree and became anglicized, and there's this cultural synthesis. So what I notice in the UK is that there's a lot of young brothers for the last three generations, Gen X, Gen Y, Millennial, who are very keen on, um, or very bookish, very keen on gaining knowledge in a way that is a little bit more abnormal where they are from, even among ulama. And someone could think of this as an insult. It's not. You look in, Muslim diasporas in America, it's the same thing. Um, but then you also have people who embrace Islam who are converts or reverts or whichever term someone wants to use, and their children who are more indigenous to different parts of the West, but who grew up in Muslim families. And there's much more of a culture. As much as the West is denigrated, I personally find much more of a culture of appreciating knowledge. Like when I'm in Algiers, a beautiful, amazing city, I have to go out of my way to find, a number of bookstores. You go to any like American town of the same size, you have bookstore after bookstore after bookstore after bookstore. In Morocco, in Casablanca, there are bookstores, there are libraries, but the appreciation for the book that you might see, even if they're bad books, you might see in Paris, for example, or London. And so, because okay, well, those books are rubbish. Okay, well, fine, but at least people are reading. and it's not to blame Muslims. I think there's a traumatization from colonialism. There's an immense impoverishment of the Muslim world, from uh, elites and within various countries who maybe monopolize resources. You have a lot of people who are just struggling to get by. That's
Yes,
understandable.
yes.
Yeah, but what I can't get are the scholarly classes within the Muslim world not having much of an appreciation for knowledge. And that strikes me as extremely dangerous, not to belabor the point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, when I studied Spanish literature, for example, um, we try to trace the influence, right? Where does this come from, these ideas and so on? And invariably, the medieval Spanish writers were imitating Arab works, structure, content, themes, and so on. The influence was profound, profound. Um, but it also went both ways. So the Christians, of course, were absorbing anything beneficial coming from, the Arab world and the Islamic world. And also they were reconnecting with their own European tradition and Greco-Roman literature. And we find that even the Moriscos, um, that they translated, uh, well, that the Greco-Roman myths and legends and so on. And so it was going both ways. The Christians were taking things from the Muslims. The Muslims in Al-Andalus were taking things from the Christians. They all felt that it was part of their heritage and that they were all equally enriched by that. But I mean, you were dealing with scholars, or ulema, and yeah. Uh, when we had that meeting in the United Arab Emirates, of course, everything revolved around the issue of authenticity. Okay. And again, to these people, and I'm afraid to say they're very myopic. I mean, to them, if something is authentic, it's authentic in the sense of being sahih, which really boils down to, is it in a canonical book of traditions with a verifiable chain of narrations? So, what's the isnad? Okay, is it sahih? Well, I took these documents and I traced their history. Okay, so I started, in the present, and I said, okay, so here's a copy, and this is the previous copy, and the previous copy. It's the history of transmission of these manuscripts. Who cited these manuscripts? Who copied these manuscripts? Going back over 1,000 years, and in some cases going all the way back to the 7th century. And I mean, they're very, very long. And what was the assessment of that scholar? And some thought they were authentic, some thought they were spurious, and so on. But anyhow, so I went through all of that, all of that, all of that, all of that. And then one of these muftis said, well, this is not the Arab way. And I wanted to tell him, anyhow, sometimes I have to bite my tongue. The Arab way? Don't you mean the Islamic way? Okay, the Islamic way, the Arab way. The tradition doesn't belong to you. You don't own this religion. But anyhow, that's what I thought. I didn't say it. Sheikh Habib Ali al-Jifri, of course, who invited me and who was there, said something very intelligent. He said, Sheikhna, there's more than one way to authenticate a document. So, Sheikh Habib Ali al-Jifri recognized that there is the traditional Arab, really, Islamic way of determining whether something is authentic or not. And maybe that might apply to traditions, but how does that apply to history? And we're dealing with something very different when we're talking about the transmission of manuscripts. Yes, Sahih, what does this mean? Authentic, what does that mean? It means that, and again, who determines what is authentic? I mean, it is, as you know, the consensus of scholars, academics, and experts in the field that the hadith literature is not reliable. Okay, no expert in the field disputes that. The literature is not reliable. There's an entire field devoted to memory science. Okay, so and so said that 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 so and so overheard his grandfather saying that the prophet said. I am sorry if that is your standard for authenticating a historical saying or document. It's farcical. It's beyond a joke. Um, Now, when you're dealing with actually tangible documents, manuscripts, and we know who copied them, when they copied them, and we have this chain of documents. So for the covenants of the prophet, we have some as late as towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, and then so we have copies. They're 20th century. They're 19th, they're 18th, they're 17th, they're 16th. Some get into the 15th and so on. And I'm just talking about one covenant, but there are others that they go all the way back. They go all the way back. We have reference to them all the way back to the 7th century. So like there's literary evidence, okay? Um, on top of the literary evidence, there's physical evidence. We have physical evidence from the early years of Islam regarding the covenants of the Prophet. I mean, they're written, in stone, for God's sake, that so and so, offers the protection of God and His messenger, blah blah blah. And so, you have the physical documents, you have the literary evidence. Um, what else? There's but also anything for it to be in journalism and scholarship and everything. Of course, you need references, you need verification. Things need to be verified. Okay. Now, can we verify this? So, yes, we find the confirmation of the covenants of the prophet in contemporary historical writings from the first century of Islam. Okay, so different Christian denominations from different parts of the world speaking different languages, right? You can't say, oh, they all cooked this up. They hated each other. They thought they were infidels and so on, all these different Christian denominations and so on. But we find the Armenians saying that, yes, the prophet gave us a covenant and he protected us. And the Copts say the same thing. And the Nestorians and the Jacobites and all of this and the Greek Orthodox, all these different denominations, they confirm that covenants of protection were granted to them. And then we can get into like structure. Well, I like try to talk to one of those muftis about, well, the structure is similar to, they wouldn't even understand what you're talking about. Like, all the tools that we use in literary criticism, they wouldn't even understand the terminology, the accurate dating. Ahmed al-Wakil, for example, has backdated many of these documents. Okay. So like they'll say that this happened on Friday of this month of this year. That is really, really difficult, okay, to forge. Let's say you're living centuries after the past. To get the day of the week and the month correct is really difficult. And we find that these covenants do line up with the actual dates. That, like, really? The second was a Monday? Like, what were the chances? Well, if you're guessing 1 in 7, but if you have many, many different documents, and they're getting the dates right, so that lends, support to their, so the dating, the archaeological evidence I was discussing, we have documents. Some of the oldest Arabic inscriptions refer to the covenants that the prophet gave to these communities. Yeah, and then we have the parallelism between the covenants of the prophet and and the versions that we have in the Arabic and Islamic sources, a shared historical memory. There were eyewitness accounts of the original covenants. And so, yeah, okay, when it comes to authenticating a document, it goes far beyond just, is it sahih, right? 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 What does it mean? Like to those people, it means, is it sahih in the ilm al-rijal hadith terminology. But other people, when they ask, is it authentic? Maybe they're asking from a historical point of view. And then for all of these reasons that I mentioned, the preponderance of evidence is in favor of authenticity. Um, does that mean word for word? Maybe not, but in terms of content, yes. And even if someone would question the content, there's a difference between a text. We need to distinguish between a text and a historical event. All of these converge and they point to a historical event. All right. So, yeah, there's more than one way to authenticate a document. Now, I've been working on these covenants for quite some time, and there's a book called Islam. Well, it's actually an encyclopedia, Islam and the People of the Book. It's in 3 volumes, and there's a study there called the Provenance of the Covenants of the Prophet, in which I trace back as much as possible every reference to the covenants of the prophet that I could come in the languages that I master, which are many. And we're continuing to do this. And so there are very, very strong historical chains of narration regarding these documents. Now, you will hear some people, some academics or some Islamophobes just dismiss these documents. They're fake. They're forgery. Well, if you're making the claim that it's fake, well, then use the scientific method. Prove that it's fake. Okay? The onus is on you to prove that these documents are fake. And these people, they haven't even looked at the evidence. Um, you know, they were recognized as authentic by the caliphs and by the sultans over the ages. Uh, uh, I mean, are these people suggesting that they all of these leaders, the caliphs and the head judges of the Ottoman Empire and all the previous empires, they were imbeciles and they were fools and they were, duped and deceived? Um, I think not. I mean, you have to prove that all of these people were wrong. And it's a tremendous task. It goes well beyond saying just dismissing that they're fake. Well, prove your case. We have made a compelling case. The body of literature on these documents has grown exponentially. It started with the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world in 2013. That book was translated into Arabic. I am one of the few Western scholars of Islam whose scholarship has actually been translated into Arabic and published in the Arab world. Uh, in Beirut. So translated into Arabic, translated into Italian, translated into Spanish. There's a smaller version of it, Six Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of his time, which has been translated into over a dozen languages, and they're available on the Internet Archive for free. I have many other books, of course, dealing with it, like Islam and the People of the Book. But, I'm not just going to talk about myself. Dr. Craig Considine, right, from Rice University, he published People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. So I would recommend scholars read that book. After that, another book came out called The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, From Shared Historical Memory to Peaceful Coexistence by Ibrahim Mohammed Zain and Ahmed El-Wakil, published by Routledge. And so the case keeps getting stronger. And so if one is to argue that these documents are inauthentic, then they need to do their homework and they need to provide a persuasive case why that is so. We have debunked all of these allegations. Many allegations have been made. They've been systematically debunked. The ball is in the court of the skeptics. But yes, it is a valid um, it is a valid question, and we should ask it. Is it authentic? But it's ironic that quite often among Muslims, the people who ask, is it authentic, never ask that about Bukhari or Muslim or Ibn Ishaq or Waqidi or really, and so really now? I mean, I've had some, I've had like Shia ulama who like believe in Bihar al-Anwar by Majlisi, and traditions of the Prophet that were compiled 1,000 years after his passing. Are you kidding me? It's one thing for them to be 150 years old, 300 years old, but when you're getting to 1,000 years, you're kind of pushing it. You really now, right? So the covenants, are they authentic? They're not authentic. Well, what about Bihar al-Anwar? What about the works of Majlisi? What about the works of Kulaini? What about the works of Saduq? And let's get to the Sunni books. What about Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood and so on? What about these books of Sirah? Are they genuine? Are they authentic? These are not questions these people ask. And so I think it's a good question, but it's one that we should ask all around. It applies to all texts. We shouldn't deify a book for God's sake. I mean, it was written by these books were written by fallible human beings.
Yeah, I definitely see that case. And I think there's a need for a lot, but more sophistication as far as how contemporary Muslims approach text. Both Shia. It's interesting you mentioned al-Majlisi, and this is something like our Sunni brothers love to beat on the 12 of Shia for how inauthentic they're in, and I think this is a valid criticism. Like there are, it's fascinating. Like I've seen like the Shia Marja. If you ask them, is a certain narration, is the isnad sahih or daif or whatnot, and what about the rawis within it? You'll have Shia ulama who like or admit, okay, yeah, this specific hadith, the isnad is bad. This specific narrator, Jabir al-Jufi, or
Yeah.
whoever, he's daif or this that, and then they'll just run with it, but not to beat up on the Shia because our Sunni brothers love to poke holes in the very real questions of authenticity of Shia narrations. And I personally am a Maliki. I don't believe in taqleed as far as like blind following. I think that's inconsistent with the Quranic idea. But
Yes, I would agree.
yeah, I think we both resonate
Yes.
with that. Yeah, it's like even the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal tells us to, to think, to ponder, He condemns those who la yaqilun, who don't reason. So Allah Azza wa Jal tells us to, you know, think about His signs and reflect on His signs. So if that's His kitab, how much anything else? Um, I find it interesting, not to belabor the point,
Mhm.
but I think there's a lot more sophisticated thought as far as authentication of books, manuscripts, and narrations and transmission among pre-modern Muslim scholars. And I don't know if it was uh, certainly before colonialism. I don't know if it was a lot of the trauma of the Crusades, the Mongol conquest, some of these other historical events, unfortunately. But there's definitely like a diminution of the scholarly capacity. And I think some of it is you do have the vagaries of time and history. You have like the Mongols, they came, and so could say, oh, that's just an excuse. Well, no, they like dumped 1 million books in the Tigris River. So could say, oh, the Muslims at the time, they're exaggerating. But we have the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim. It's like, well, that doesn't record 1 million books. Okay, well, fine. There's one book catalog. It's pretty clear, from the literature, even something's exaggerated, that one town in like Baghdad had, fine, if you don't want to say millions of books, hundreds of thousands of books. That's still more than anything else on the planet at the time. Okay, well, then Andalus, you look at what was burned and destroyed in the Reconquista. You looked at the the ships of books that were going from Andalus to the Moroccan Sultan, and I think it was the Knights of Saint John, or one of those bands in Portugal or Spain. I can't remember which one, but they had this naval battle, sank everyone, brought one ship of books back. They went to the Vatican Library. What wasn't useful was just burned, and just multiple, like 500 years ago, 600 years ago. You had this repeated set of historical trauma. So I just say that to kind of like preface, like, yes, there's a regrettable uh, closing of the Muslim mind, but some of it I think is due to trauma. That's not an excuse. It's a partial explanation. But that notwithstanding, there's an interesting, I can't remember the name. He's a Dutch academician. And he has a site on the internet about Arabic paleography, and I can't remember his name, unfortunately. Short-term memory lapses the older I get. But he had a very interesting book that looked into the science of book transmission. Well, the intellectual sciences and of book transmission in the pre-modern Arab world, and you have this sophisticated set of apparatus that, as far as recording who copied it. You have these colophon inscriptions with the copyist, the
Right.
date copied, what text it was copied from, where it was copied from. You can establish transmission, and you look and you see that among pre-modern Muslim Islamic scholars across the Muslim world, there was an engagement as far as discerning the transmission of texts as well as the textual content. And I think there was more of an understanding that Sahih didn't mean authentic. I think that pre-modern hadith scholars and Muslim historians who are in the ilm of tariq actually understood that just because something's Sahih doesn't mean it's literally true. And you have different types of rawayat.
Yes.
Rawaya bilafs, is a literal transmission. Literal, this is the literal text. This is literally what Rasulullah, peace and blessings upon him and his family, said. Another one, Rawaya bil al Ma'na,
Yeah.
The Rawaya al Hadith, Aila al Ma'na, the transmission of the Hadith or the text upon the meanings. That's paraphrasing.
Right.
And yeah, like yes, you're aware, but I think many of the people listening aren't aware of these things. That it is known, or it was known to pre-modern hadith scholars, and I think a lot of modern contemporary, like real traditional scholars of hadith, not just academic, but in Morocco and Algeria and Mauritania and Syria, whatnot, that they realize like a lot of the content of Sahih al-Bukhari is technically rawaya al-ma'na, is rawaya by the meaning, not rawaya bil-lafs, not the
Yes.
literal. And as a Maliki, I note that at least in the Western Islamic world, Andalusia, um, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, those names of those countries didn't exist for that region.
Yes.
West Africa, Takror region that became, Senegal and Mali and Chad, and these areas. That the Muwatta of Imam Malik was always held. Well, first of all, there's a reluctance to say that this book is the most authentic after the Quran, because it's like, how can you compare the Quran with any canonical text? So there's that reluctance to even go there that I think was very present within that juridical and intellectual tradition. But like, if there was a book after the Quran that was authentic, it would be the Muwatta Malik. which you look at Imam Malik, okay, well, he studied with people like Zuhri, and Zuhri studied with people like uh, Ibn Omar, right? And
Right.
like these early Medina scholars who literally, they were literally the children of the young Sahaba anyway. You had children of Ibn Abbas, Ibn Omar, you had children of, of Ibn Masud, and their immediate students. So not just their children transmitting to others, but you had like when they were old men, you had other people come and they learned from them. And that, the generation of Malik, someone could say, okay, he's like 100 years old. You know, my grandmother just passed away at the age of 90. My other grandmother, she only passed away a few years ago. She lived a few years longer. She would be 100. You have people, that my mother knew people who were literally alive during the Civil War.
Hmm.
My mother knew old people. They're extremely old. They're on their deathbeds, but they were born into slavery in the American context. Um, and so that's like what if I had to like, X degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, quote unquote. You
Right.
know, how many degrees of separation am I from the Civil War? My really there are people who in my grandparents' generation who were middle aged to elderly, but still with their cognitive faculties. So they told stories. My grandparents told stories directly to me and to my parents, and so on and so forth. So if I put that human reality of a historical transmission in the time of early Islam, I think is reasonable within the first century, late first century, early to mid second century. I think is reasonable that someone will like there's like Motziki. I think like he's done a lot of work on analysis of isnad bundles,
Yes.
and yeah, people like Fred Donner. You have like the revisionists who are much more skeptical, and then you have other academic scholars who say, okay, well, there's something we can work with. Maybe some of this text is spurious, maybe some of them have been altered, or human memory transmission, but there's a core there. I think, not to belabor the point, but I do think that earlier scholars of hadith and early scholars of fiqh, also because it seems like people in the fiqh tradition had a much more nuanced understanding of what hadith could be used for. I think they had a lot more cognizance that you're dealing with things that aren't necessarily literally true, but they represent something that was a core of truth, and we can work with that. That's why, like for the Malikis and Hanafis, if there's a hadith that only has one chain of transmission, it's a khabar wahid or an ahad rawaya. You have a hadith that, okay, it's one from one from one. One Sahabi supposedly heard Rasulullah say it, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, radiallahu an, the Sahabi. Then a student heard from him, and then another student. As a wahid khabar. For the Hanafis, especially the early Hanafis, they changed some of their methodologies over the centuries as they encountered debates with the Shafis and Hanbalis. And there's this fascinating intellectual history there. But the early ones said you can't take an article of belief. You can't take Aqidah from a singular narrated hadith. And it was the same with the Malikis. In fact, there's some famous sayings from Imam Malik who said, if you take one from one from one, that will strip the sunnah from you. Like if you want this thing called the sunnah, if you're taking narrations one from one from one, it will actually strip it from you. Um, and at most, for both the Hanafis and Malikis, if you have a singular narration, it can only be used. The evidence is called, it basically is dhani. So technically, it's considered speculative. It's not qati, it's not cutting, it's not absolute.
Yes.
That is part of the methodology of both those schools to this day, if people actually engaged it versus just taking dogma. It's this realization that, okay, this text says something, is sahih, we can use it as juridical evidence, but it's technically only speculative. So that means we don't believe that it actually yields certitude, absolute truth. But it's speculative. It's a strong enough piece of evidence
to support a juridical position, but we can't take belief from it, so we can't make this into our aqidah. I think the Salafiyah, without beating up on them, like there's, maybe someone could say there's been a gradual closing of the Muslim mind, but I really believe that, like Jonathan Brown once called Sunni Islam a cult of authenticity. And Jonathan Brown's a Hanbali. So he's very much into that Hanbali tradition, and he believes it, he practices it. But he did recognize that Sunni Islam, you could call it a quote unquote cult of authenticity, a siha. I actually believe that that's more the case for specific streams like the Zaharis, the Hanbalis, and I think that there was a lot more flexibility. And I think the Shia have it too, with their division between the Akbaris and
The Usulis.
yes, yes, yeah. The Akbaris strike me as the sort of Salafi or Hanbali or Zahari, Zahariya stream within the 12 Shia, and the Usulis are open to Ijtihad.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting that the Revolutionary Guard and the post-revolutionary Iranian Shia kind of orthodoxy, they're technically Usuli, but it's not criticism of them. Just like I'm not criticizing, the Gulf Arab sponsored Sunni Salafiyah, but I think that inflexibility, like you mentioned, the waves of apostasy, that there are people who would find Islam to be full of intelligence and intellectual and spiritual richness, and then they encounter people who literally want to beat you, or beat a woman if like her hijab is on wrong, her scarf is on wrong. And I've read khabars that there were women in Medina, some of the Jawari, the female servants and slave girls, like they would walk around sometimes, with arms exposed, sometimes part of the bodice exposed, sometimes not wearing a hair scarf. And someone will get, very angry. It's like, Ahi, how can you say that? There's tahrif in that text. Prove it. Where's your Burhan? In
Yes.
It's like, but you tell someone something that they like that fits their perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm sorry for just going on too long.
No.
What you're saying resonates with
it
me.
does. You made some excellent points for sure. Yes, I mean, all that subtlety is lost on the average Muslim, unfortunately. Yeah, all those different shades.
But do you think that can be revived? And maybe this going into your, maybe segue more into your work on the covenants, and if you're open to it, if you have the time, I want to be respectful, first of all, of the amount of time you have today, but also in the future, if you would be open to maybe some of a more formal presentation of academic one regarding things like the Treaty of Al-Maqna, specific, transmissions of a couple of the different the covenants and treaties and the Mithaq. So if you're open to that, I would be delighted. And I think that presenting it to, my audience is small, but I want to try to increase conversation and thinking about these things. So if you're open to doing something more formal in the future, I would be delighted. But
Sure. Yes,
now,
I would be open to that.
great, thank you.
And I still have a bit of time. We could touch upon these other questions that you had sent me.